Hello and welcome to Policing TV. My name is Scarlett Haig and today I'm joined by Professor Mark Fenton-O'Creevy, Professor of Organisational Behaviour at the Open University Business School. And today we're going to be discussing an article that Mark has been producing recently. But I thought we might be able to start with an introduction from Mark and hear a bit about who you are.
Sure. Good to be here, Scarlett. I'm, as you said, a professor of organisational behaviour, and what that means is that I study behaviour in and by organisations, and I've been doing that for just over 30 years, including studies of what goes on inside investment banks, large multinational companies and so on. And in more recent years, I've started to get very interested in policing organisations. And I'm part of a centre at the Open University called the Centre for Policing, Learning and Research, which has members from more than half the forces in the UK.
Brilliant. And you recently published an article in the Journal of Policing, is that right?
Yeah. So really the research question we started with was, how do organisations that employ many good people end up by failing to notice, prevent or address lots of egregious bad behaviour by members of the organisation? And it's not a unique thing to policing, this kind of problem, but the people like myself, scholars of organisations, have for many, many years been very interested in how does knowledge get created, used and responded to in organisations. But more recently, we've become interested in something that's at the kind of the reverse of that, which is how does ignorance get produced, used and reproduced in organisations? And that's the sort of frame which we used for looking at the research that we conducted in the end. And how it started actually was back in 2023, the centre I'm part of had organised a workshop for police officers and staff and academics like myself to look together at what kind of research could be helpful in thinking about the kinds of legitimacy problems that policing was facing, post, for example, the Sarah Everard murder and other kinds of things that came to light. And I was very struck by the way in which many of the policing practitioners present in the workshop talked about the way things got ignored or the way things that were known didn't get acted on in their organisation. So I introduced some ideas from this emerging literature on the ways ignorance is produced and, for example, strategies that organisations use to ignore uncomfortable knowledge. And what was quite interesting was that this way of thinking about it really resonated with a lot of the people in the workshop who immediately said, yeah, no, I can give you examples of that in my organisation. So that started to be quite an important way of framing things. And what we did is we we didn't go out and do primary research. We pulled together a lot of data that was already around. So the kinds of data we drew on, first of all, some of it was in the public domain. So, for example, the Casey review into the Met, we drew on all of the documents that had been produced out of that. The first part of the Angelini inquiry had just become available. But we also drew on data from a big study that my colleagues had been involved in from Operation Soteria that had been funded by the Home Office to look at the policing of rape and serious sexual offences, which had produced quite a lot of qualitative data as well as various kinds of quantitative data. So that gave us quite a broad range of, in fact, an enormous corpus of qualitative data about other investigations into things going on inside policing. And we analysed this within this kind of frame of trying to understand the ways in which ignorance gets produced in organisations. And the first set of things that we looked at was the strategies that organisations use to avoid uncomfortable knowledge. What is uncomfortable knowledge? Uncomfortable knowledge often is all organisations run on simplified narratives of how the world works. The world's very, very complex, and to make sense of it and to act, we actually need to have simplified narratives. But a lot of those narratives are to do with who we are. For example, in policing, narratives about the Pelian principles and policing by consent and British policing being the best kind of policing in the world. And uncomfortable knowledge is knowledge that throws these kinds of core narratives that you rely on into question. That's a very kind of uncomfortable form of knowledge because it really throws into doubt your sense of who you are and who the organisation you work for is. So it's not uncommon for organisations to see various kinds of strategies for avoiding uncomfortable knowledge. And 4 kinds of strategies that we looked at and found in policing organisations. First of all, outright denial or refusal to accept information. And there was, for example, just to give one example, the denial that problems are at all systemic, but instead should be understood as just a few bad apples. Really important example of that in the Casey report, where Casey talks about a sergeant being with them and also overhearing remarks from an officer that they would enjoy raping a celebrity. And when asked what he was going to do about it, he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't hear anything." But also, that's a sort of micro example. But another example would be in one of the workshops we ran. A couple of senior female police officers talked about the response of their chief officer to the Casey report, who had basically said to them all, "Well, this is the Met, this is not us. We don't have these kinds of problems." They went on to say, "Well, nobody was asking us about our experiences of misogyny in this force," and to talk about the difficulty of challenging the view that misogyny, racism, and homophobia were not a problem in their force, but were confined to the Met. The second strategy is more subtle, dismissal. That's accepting that that there's information available. It's not denying it, but it's finding ways of downplaying it or denigrating it. And again, a really interesting example in the Casey report, where she says, "We were told of one senior Met officer telling others in their chain of command that it was all right to colour outside the lines because firearm officers are harder to replace than other officers and need to be cherished." Now, why is that dismissal? Well, the use of euphemism is a way of reducing the emotional impact of a statement. And so since it's our emotional reactions to information that drive our propensity to act on it, that's really important. So, and what does colouring outside the lines do? It conjures up harmless images of a toddler colouring in a colouring book. It doesn't raise the same kind of emotional reaction as saying, actually, we tolerate egregious breaches of professional standards. Another tactic for avoiding uncomfortable knowledge. Diversion. That's diverting activities to achieve alternative goals, for example. Briefings about evidence of briefings about the organisation's intention to reduce racism, misogyny and homophobia, and to encourage people to report such instances, being corrupted, diverted to a different purpose, where people in those in some of those meetings were told, we don't want any more people handing their phones in. Take a look at your WhatsApps and Facebook statuses and messages. Look carefully. They're coming for everyone now. Protect yourselves. Another kind of diversion that you can see quite a lot in organisations like policing organisations is you carefully constrain the terms of any review to avoid it unearthing or surfacing various kinds of uncomfortable knowledge. Casey certainly suggested this was the case with the Operation Leven review of the Diplomatic Protection Unit in the Met, which is where Sarah Everard's murderer came from. And finally, a final strategy, displacement. That's about putting effort into activities that only superficially seem like they're going to address an underlying problem, but in reality have little chance of doing so. In the Soteria data, for example, we saw a lot of evidence of enormous overwork and workplace stress amongst officers, but also evidence that the reaction to that was not to try and address the underlying causes, but to take a sort of sticking plaster approach of trying to fix people once they were broken. In the Casey report, Casey talks a lot about what she describes as initiative itis, which is lots and lots of short-term initiatives that were not planned or continued for the long term, that ultimately had very little effect, but were somewhat costly in terms of resources they consumed. Alongside this question of the avoidance of uncomfortable knowledge, we were very interested in another area which is described as organisational silence. It's what are the organisational conditions that predispose people to remain silent about stuff that would be really important for them to move up the organisation. So in looking at this, we found three particular kinds of issues that were there in generating organisational silence. First of all, a lot of learned helplessness. People talking about our experiences. There's no point in trying to push this upwards and ask for things to be done because nothing happens. One senior RASO officer talking about, I hate the fact I can't give them the things they need to get the job done, and that sometimes I have to watch some of them fall apart. And there's not really anything within my power to do. All I've got is warm words for them, and it makes me feel dirty and horrible. But also people having a fear of speaking out. One officer saying, I've been involved in a disciplinary hearing for another officer where I was a witness, and talking about the way he was then treated by more senior police officers and his colleagues who would walk out of the room when he sat down in it. Wow. But another important element here, I think, is what's called double binds. Double binds are the idea that it can happen in organizations that you get two conflicting instructions. And what makes it a double blind is that the second one really isn't discussable. And a very common form of this in organisations is the requirement to do more with less. And we saw that a lot in the sort of RASO policing context, where the experience was of getting lots of demands to really do more and raise the importance of violence against women and girls. But at the same time, the lack of resources, notably technological resources that were needed to be really productive in that area, was completely undiscussable. And officers talked about, we push up these concerns and we just get told to sort it out, as opposed to any real engagement with the underlying problem. And that sense of being trapped in this double bind that is effectively undiscussable is something that can be really toxic in organisations. And finally, one of the areas that we looked at was there's a lot of talk in many organisations about organisational learning and becoming a learning organisation, but much less is said about the ways in which organisations can become non-learning organisations. And in the paper, we discussed some of the evidence that parts of policing have become non-learning organisations.
That was really fascinating, Mark. And I think in the next part, we'll discuss some of the opportunities for improvements that can be made on the back of this research.